Welcome to Anatomy Physiology, Chapter 11, Part 3. So there's a lot of information about muscles and nerves. And I'm going to spend time talking about the physiology of what the muscles and nerves do. And then on your own time, you guys can memorize as many of the muscles as you want to, and as many of the different types of nerves as there are. So we're going to talk about the fast twitch fibers and the slow twitch fibers, but that's, well, first of all, there's an error on the slide. So it says they're both quickly, and this one is relatively slow, although 100 milliseconds is a fraction of a second. It's like a tenth of a second. So, but that for a muscle is fairly slow, whereas the fast twitch are the ones that are 8 milliseconds, so quite a bit faster. So probably this should be changed. There, I feel better now. I added a little piece in there. The ones that are going to be slow twitch are going to be red. Most muscles are red, but these are going to be really red because they have a lot of myoglobin. And myoglobin gives the muscles their deep red color. And I mentioned before, myoglobin is a little bit like hemoglobin. It carries oxygen, but it has a much higher affinity, so it's much better at carrying oxygen because you really need a lot of oxygen to keep your muscles going. Well, what's the advantage of having a relatively slow muscle twitch? Well, this would be for endurance. If you're having to stand at attention, if you're having to hold something, if you're working a cash register, you're going to need endurance. You're going to have to be able to stand for long periods of time or hold things. If you're a mother nursing your baby, you have to hold the baby. So there's a lot of things that you're going to need a lot of endurance for. You need to be able to do this for a long period of time. So if you're doing something quickly, you're going to burn up all the energy that you have. You're going to use up your oxygen, you're going to use up your ATP. So two slow muscles are the erector spinae of the back and the soleus of the calf because they help you maintain your posture. They also have a lot of mitochondria. They are well nourished by capillaries, so you get a lot of red blood cells coming in to provide oxygen with hemoglobin as well as the myoglobin. And then they have a special kind of myosin, so it's not the same kind as the fast twitch. So it has a slower ATPase, so it's not going to break it down as fast. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is the same thing as endoplasmic reticulum, it's going to release the calcium more slowly. So they're just slightly modified to be a little bit slower in contracting. So where do you need fast? Where do you need a fast twitch? Well, your eyes for sure. Your hand is another one that you need fast twitch. You don't really think of the gastrocnemius muscle of the calf. You would think that that would be more for posture, but you have to be able to run. You have to be able to be quick. So anybody who does sports can tell you about that. So you're going to have a myosin with a fast ATPase, so you can pull that phosphate off quickly, get that burst of energy, and you're also going to have larger sarcoplasmic reticulum, so you're going to be able to hold more calcium. The other thing that's different about the fast twitch are they don't have time to have the myoglobin and the hemoglobin giving them the energy, the oxygen. So they have the ability to store up glycogen, creatine phosphate, and so they are a kind of a whitish as opposed to the really dark red muscles. The fibers are thicker and stronger so that they can do what they need to do quickly. And they're grouped in larger motor units. So the gastrocnemius muscle is very large. And they're controlled by larger, less excitable neurons. So that would be kind of counterintuitive. You would think that the more nerve endings that you have, the more bouton you have, the more bang for your buck you're going to get. I switched back to the other slide, and here at the bottom it says that the slow twitch, the red ones, are going to be grouped in small motor units controlled by small, easily excited motor neurons, allowing for precise movements. Again, that's kind of opposite of what you would think. But stop the video after you hear my directions and try this out. Stand behind a chair and lift one foot while you're holding on to the chair. Now take your hand off of the chair, and you'll be surprised. All of a sudden you can feel individual bunches of muscles having to contract in various places. Otherwise you'll start tottering. Now older people totter more than younger people, but it was a revelation to me when I first tried that out, because somebody told me, if you're holding on standing on one foot versus if you take your hand off and continue to stand on the same foot, you'll start wobbling. And I thought, no, you won't. And I tried it and I wobbled. So it was like, wow. So that's why you need small, easily excited motor neurons. So as you feel yourself starting to sag, to lean, to wobble, the muscle to slip, then you just recruit another little group and correct. So you're constantly auto-correcting. All right, now that you've started the video back after you tried the experiment, we're going to talk about the fact that there are different kinds of muscles in animals than humans have. And genetically, some people have endurance, more muscles for endurance, and others have more of the sprinter kind of muscles, so that they can go quickly but then give out rather quickly, where the others may not be as fast, but they can go on for a longer time with their muscles. Another interesting thing about muscles is they can generate more tension than the bones and the tendons can withstand. So I was watching some weightlifting stuff with someone who enjoyed that sort of thing, and I was trying to, find some things that we had in common. And I was sitting there watching these people trying to lift cars and lift these huge weights and watching their bones break. And I thought, oh, this is not a sport that I want to watch. So you can continue with your muscles contracting to the point where you snap your bones or rip your tendons. So where are you going to get your muscle strength? Well, if you've got a thicker muscle, you're going to have more of those cross bridges between the actin and the myosin. The way the fascicles are arranged, the pinnate, the ones that look like feathers, are stronger than those that are just parallel. And parallel is stronger than circular. And if you remember us looking at the graph where they were showing the muscle twitch, the stimulation, and then we reached tetany, we went through summation first, and as you go through summation, you're going to go up towards tetany, and the more units that you can get to summate, the more recruitment that you get, obviously the more tension you can get, the more contraction that you can get. One of the things that you can do is fitness conditioning, where you exercise and you train your muscles. What does muscular strength depend on? Temporal means over time. So how many muscle fibers do you have that you can recruit? So obviously someone who's got a lot of muscles is going to be able to get a lot more muscular strength. The greater the frequency of stimulation, the more strongly a muscle contracts. And if the muscle is just at the right tension, so you don't want it contracted and you don't want it stretched out. You want it just right. And that you're going to get a more forceful contraction. So the length of the muscle and the tension in the muscle determines a lot about how much of a contraction that you're going to get. The other thing is, if you're just tired, you've used your muscles, then they're going to contract more weakly. You're running out of ATP energy. You are having trouble getting the potassium to go back inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So you're just not going to get the same amount of strength as you did when your muscles were full of glycogen, they were full of ATP energy, and you had plenty of oxygen. So what happens when you do weightlifting? Well, they call that resistance training because you are contracting a muscle against a load that resists movement. So again, if you're talking physics, you're doing no work at all, but because you're not moving anything. But a few minutes of resistance exercise a few times a week is all you need to get the muscle to start growing. But you're not going to grow new muscle fibers. You're going to grow new myofilaments and myofibrils within the existing muscles that you already have. So growth is from cellular enlargement, not growing new cells. And it's hard for people to believe, but that's also the way that fat cells work. The growth is from cellular enlargement and not growing more fat cells. So you look at somebody who's a little skinny, and you look at somebody who is gargantuan, and you go, and no, there's no way they have the same amount of fat cells. And it's like, yep, the fat person is very good at stuffing fat inside those cells. So a person who does resistance training is very good at growing new myofilaments and myofibrils to make the cells bigger. So resistance training is going to give you larger muscle cells, muscle fibers. And if you do aerobic exercise where you run out of oxygen, you're going to increase your endurance. You're going to train your body. This is what we do when we run out of oxygen. We just keep going. We're going to make lactic acid, but that's all right. So endurance training improves your skeletal strength, and it causes your slow twitch fibers. Remember, endurance is slow twitch, to make more mitochondria, to store more glycogen, and to get more blood capillaries growing in, supplying the oxygen that you need. Doing this enhances the function of your heart, your cardiovascular system, and your lungs, and your nervous system. So endurance training, aerobic exercise, it doesn't seem like that would be all that beneficial, but it is. So we've been talking about skeletal muscles. We've been talking about how they contract, how the actin and the myosin works. And now we're going to talk about the other two types of muscle. One of them is cardiac, which is your heart, and your smooth muscle is your involuntary. It's the stuff that your brain takes care of, and you don't have to sit there and think about doing it. It just, your body takes care of it in the background. So there's several vocabulary words on this slide that we need to talk about. So when we talk about somatic motor neurons, these are your body motor neurons. These are the ones that have the axons with the axon terminal, the bouton, they release the acetylcholine. But we're going to be talking about cardiac muscles, and they get their innervation, the nerve stimulation, from the autonomic nervous system. Now we have a whole chapter on the autonomic nervous system coming up, so we'll just leave it there, and we'll come back and pick it up in the next chapter. So cardiac and smooth muscle are both considered involuntary. You do not have to tell your heart to beat. That would just, can you imagine? Okay, you need to beat. Okay, now it's time to beat again. All right, about every second you'd have to tell your heart to beat. So it's a good thing that it is taken over by the autonomic nervous system, or the automatic nervous system. I think that ought to be called. And the cardiac muscle, though, is striated. It has stripes on it, just like the skeletal muscle does, but it's pretty easy to tell the two apart. This is a picture of cardiac muscle, and here are your stripes. You can see the light bands and the dark bands, and you can just hopefully imagine the actin and the myosin and how they're sliding together and then releasing and then sliding together. But if you notice, it looks like somebody's gone through and taken some of these and bound them up with, it looks like a rubber band right there. Here's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. These are called intercalated disc. So you have the striations or the stripes like you have for skeletal muscle, but unlike skeletal muscle, these are held together with intercalated disc. Another thing is they're only going to have one nucleus, whereas in this skeletal muscle, because you can rip and tear and merge some of the cells, you can actually have more than one nucleus inside of there. So luckily for us, cardiac muscle contracts with a regular rhythm. It works whether you're asleep or whether you're awake, and without any conscious attention to it. Although you can take over. You can say, okay, I need to slow my heartbeat down. Whatever was scaring me or causing my heart to race, I just needed to quit. And they call this biofeedback. You literally say, okay, I'm taking control. All right, heart, slow down. Take some deep breaths, count to 10, and slow your heartbeat down. So I used to do that. I had a personal trainer who had me hooked up, and just every now and then, just for fun, I would do that. I would just take over my heart and say, okay, slow way down. And he would freak out. He goes, are you doing that thing again that you do? And I just smile and go, yeah. He goes, you're scaring me. You're scared. Don't do that anymore. So 2 things, or 3 things actually, that are required of cardiac muscle. You can't have it fatigue, because you can't stop your heart and say, okay, let's recharge here and get going again. You've got to keep it going. You can slow it down. You can rest if you're overexerting your heart, but if you don't allow your heart to rest, you could end up with a heart attack. I know a family member who was sitting at a red light and was so angry that they had to sit at the red light. Then they just got angrier and angrier and cussing and swearing and carrying on, and they got their adrenaline going, they got their heart racing to the point he had a heart attack. And before he died, he goes, I knew better. I'm a doctor. I knew better than to get that mad at that traffic light. Another thing that your cardiac muscle has to be able to do is the muscle cells have to be able to beat in unison. So it's unlike those muscle twitches that we did when we're doing balancing and posture. We need the heart to beat as a unit. So, and we need it to push long enough to get the blood out. So we're going to be sending blood over to the lungs while we're simultaneously sending blood throughout the rest of the body. So we'll do a whole unit on the heart and talk about that. And this is what makes that possible, because you have banded these muscle fibers together with the intercalated disc. So when the message goes out for the heart to beat, the message goes through these intercalated discs and everybody beats at the same time. These intercalated discs have electrical gap junctions, which allows each of the cardiac cells to directly stimulate its neighbor. So it's like they're all plugged into the same power strip. There are also mechanical junctions that hold the cardiac cells together, the cardiomyocytes. If you damage the heart muscle, you're going to replace it with fibers. You're not going to replace it with muscle fibers. So after a heart attack, functional muscle is not regenerated. So we kind of saw something like this when we were talking about the compartment syndrome, where you have that muscle that's encased in the fascia, and if you damage it enough and you get swelling enough inside the muscle, that'll actually kill the muscle fibers. You cannot regenerate them, but you can regenerate axon endings. You can grow new axon endings. It's a slow process, but you can do it. But muscles, you can't regenerate. They're just replaced with scar tissue. There's a built-in pacemaker in the heart that sets the rhythm of the cardiac muscle. So when we do the heart, we're going to talk about the sinoatrial node, the SA node, and the atrioventricular node, the AV node, and how they keep the heart beating for us. And then, of course, we'll talk about pacemakers for people who can't pace themselves. They've lost the area that triggers the heartbeats. So you have to do it mechanically. The autonomic nervous system can kick in and increase your heart rate or slow your heart rate, and it can also change your contraction strength. Back in the time before COVID, we used to take the heart out of a turtle or a frog, and we would attach it to a string, and we would add adrenaline to it and see what would happen. So here's a video, and it shows them dropping some adrenaline on the frog's heart. And you can see the heart beating outside the body. And they have it hooked up to a tracing apparatus. So you can actually see the normal activity of the heart beating. And then you add the adrenaline. So there was the normal tracing. Now they're adding the adrenaline again. You're going to get stronger contractions and faster. The heart's going to need oxygen, so you're going to do aerobic respiration almost exclusively. Marathon runners might be able to get by with a little bit of anaerobic, but the heart can't do that very well, not like the skeletal muscles can. Because the heart can't stop beating, it has especially large mitochondria, so it's really cranking out the ATP energy. Also, if you've ever seen heart muscle, it's very red, so you've got a lot of myoglobin, and in times of rest, you can store up a little bit of glycogen. And as we mentioned before, the heart muscle beats much more slowly. And now, again, that sounds funny because 250 milliseconds is a fourth of a second. So, but that's considered slow. That's very slow. So it doesn't do quick twitches like skeletal muscle does, because it's kind of like running a three-legged race. All the muscle fibers are kind of tied together with those intercalated discs. And the third type of muscles that we're going to talk about is smooth muscle. Again, remember, you're not in control of your smooth muscle usually. Although with biofeedback, you can train yourself to talk to your smooth muscle and cause it to do what you want it to do. Another thing, well, the biggest thing, the way you can tell it from the other two, it's not striped. It doesn't have those light and dark regions, the striations. It also is able to do mitosis, and when we talk about mitosis in that chapter where we did cell division, smooth muscle can divide. And hyperplasia is where you have more than a normal amount of a particular tissue. In this case, talking about smooth muscle. If you injure smooth muscle, because you can do mitosis, you can regenerate it. You don't have to replace it with scar tissue. So that's one way that it is different. One way that it is different from cardiac and skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is much slower than the skeletal and the cardiac muscles. But it can, once it contracts, stay contracted without fatiguing, which is kind of good because one of the things that it has smooth muscles are your sphincters. So you really, really, really want the sphincter that's holding your urine in not to let go, not to fatigue. And the one that's holding in your fecal material, you don't want that to just suddenly let go and let the feces out. So it's a good thing that the autonomically controlled, involuntary, smooth muscle can remain contracted for a long time without fatigue. When we were looking at the skeletal muscle, we came to the end of the axon. We saw the axon terminal. We saw the bouton that has the vesicles with the acetylcholine in it. Excuse me. In this, you have something called varicosities. So it's kind of a widening in the road. And you've probably heard of varicose veins. When we do the blood system, when we talk about the blood vessels, one of the things that happens in blood vessels is sometimes the valves become incompetent and they can't hold back the blood. And so the blood pools in an area of the blood vessel and it widens it, and you can actually see it through the skin. And so we talk about varicose veins, or where the blood is pooling in the blood vessels underneath the skin to the point where you can see it. In case you don't know what I'm talking about, here's varicose veins. Right there. And the older you get, usually the more you have of them, and the more you're on your feet, the more of them you have. So here's an autonomic nerve fiber branching off, and then having a varicosity, or a bulge, and it comes over here to the next muscle fiber and bulges again. Just like the skeletal muscles, you can't let the nerve touch the muscle because this is having electric conductivity and this has electric conductivity, and you don't want them shorting out. So you're going to have a synaptic vesicle putting neurotransmitter across the synapse. So it's a chemical that's going to go across, as opposed to electricity from this one jumping over to electrically charge this one. So I know where I'm going to find cardiac muscle. I'm going to find that in my heart. I know where I'm going to find skeletal muscle. It's going to be attached to all of my bones. So where would I find smooth muscle? I'm going to find that within the walls of hollow organs. So the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, is one of the places that they really talk about smooth muscle activity. So within the GI tract, you've got smooth muscle going longitudinally, longwise, and then you have it going around. So you have them at 90-degree angles with each other. So why is this important? Well, when we talk about peristalsis, you want the food to go from your mouth down your esophagus towards your stomach. When you squeeze the esophagus, you don't want the food to squirt back up in your mouth and squirt back down like what would happen if you squeeze a tube of toothpaste in the middle. When you do that, the toothpaste goes down to the bottom of the tube and it squirts out of the top both. That would not work. I want the food only to go down. So at the same time I'm squeezing around the esophagus, I have those longitudinal muscle fibers that are pushing downward. So I'm squeezing and pushing downward at the same time, and they're working together. This is a lot easier when I can show you my hands. You can contract your blood vessels or expand your blood vessels using these smooth muscles. In the case of your iris, you can change your pupil size, so you can make your eyes wide open to let in more light, or smaller to cut down on all the light that's going to the back of your eye, to your retina. And then another place where you have really fine control are your erector pili. And those are the little muscles that are attached to each of your hairs. And when they contract, it causes your hairs to stand up. And we call these goosebumps. Here's a cartoon representation of what I was talking about. Here's your longitudinal layer. This is a cross section where they've cut part of the GI tract and let you look down inside. And then there's your circular layer. So this is the one that's going to be squeezing right here, and this one is going to be pushing downward in a ripple effect, pushing downward, pushing downward. Now we all know that you can reverse that. So all you have to do is put your finger down your throat and you will reverse peristalsis, and then instead of pushing in the downward direction, it pushes in the upward direction, and you end up throwing up. I'll probably talk about this again when we get into the chapter on digestion and talking about the GI tract. But one of the coolest things I think of are the people we call Yogi, and they have worked on talking to the inside of their body. And one of the things to show that you are truly a master of the techniques that the yogi have to learn is you can sit in a basin of water and you can actually reverse peristalsis, and you can drink the water up through your anus. Now, why you would ever want to do that, I don't know, but how cool is it that they learned to do that? The cells that make up the smooth muscle, the myocytes that make up the smooth muscle, are fusiform in shape, and if you remember, that means pointed on either end. There's only one nucleus, just like the cardiac muscle. And you still have the thick and thin filaments. You have to have actin and myosin, but they don't line up in the stripes that you see in cardiac muscle and that you see in the skeletal muscle. You also have sarcoplasmic reticulum, but you don't have nearly as much as you do as in the skeletal muscle. You don't have the Z disc that you have in the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, but you do have something called dense bodies, because you do have to anchor the thin and thick filaments so that they can slide across each other. Another way that smooth muscle is very different than the other two is you still have synapses. We looked at those synapses and the varicosities. But each of the motor units contracts independently of the others. So in the case of the heart, we can't have that happening. If you have that happening, then you have what we call atrial fibrillation or ventricular fibrillation, and that's obviously not a good thing, where everybody is contracting whenever they want to instead of being under the control of the SA node or the AV node. So that's not okay. But in the case of smooth muscle, it's all right for each of the motor units contracting independently. Now, when we were looking at skeletal muscle, we noticed that they tend to contract in groups, in in bunches. Sometimes it's a small bunch and sometimes it's a larger bunch, but they tend to do that. And think about the deltoid, where you can contract just the front of the muscle or just the top of the muscle or just the back of the muscle, depending on which way you want to move your arm. So in this one, the individual motor units contract independently. There are some places you do want the smooth muscle to contract as a unit. And in your blood vessels, in your urinary tract, places where you're going to have that inner circular and the outer longitudinal, the ones that are 90-degree angles to each other. In this case, you're going to join these cells with gap junctions. And they can directly stimulate each other, and a large number of the cells contract as one. So you get that ripple of the longitudinal and the clasping or the encircling of the circular ones. Here's just a little cartoon picture showing you that some of them have gap junctions holding them together. So when they get stimulated, the stimulation will pass through the gap junction into the next one. So they will both beat or both contract at the same time. So since you don't have to think about making your smooth muscle contract, what does make it contract? Well, we saw the varicosities and we saw the neurotransmitter, but you can also do it with carbon dioxide, hormones, oxygen, pH. And they gave you an example here. Hopefully everyone knows about birth and how the uterus has contractions, and they tell you to push, and they tell you not to push. But it's really hard when they tell you not to push, because the hormone oxytocin stimulates the uterine contractions. So it's like, I don't care what the doctor's saying, we're pushing. So sometimes they get very aggravated with you that you're not controlling it, but they also know that you have the oxytocin that's pushing the baby out. Temperature can cause a muscle to contract or relax, and if you're cold, then those erector pili, he persists in calling them piloerector muscles, but most books call it erector pili. They're going to contract when you're cold, and you'll see little goosebumps all over you. So it's really easy to tell people, they're like, oh, no, I don't need a coat. And you look at them and they're covered with goosebumps, and you go, yeah, you do, you're cold. I can tell by looking at you that you're cold. As a mother, we've fought this battle before. Another thing that can cause the excitation of smooth muscle is just stretching it. So as you fill your stomach, then it starts contracting. You have these waves of contraction, and you're churning the food around, and then you're going to relax the sphincter that lets the food out of the stomach and on into the intestine so you can absorb it and finish digesting it. So this should look like a bit of a review here. In smooth muscle, contraction is always triggered by calcium. You need ATP energy to cock the head of the myosin, and you do it with sliding filaments, the actin and the myosin. So that's true of all the different muscle types. You can open the ion channels, the calcium, the potassium, and the sodium channels with mechanical stretch, with voltage, or with chemicals, like neurotransmitters. There are some differences in the way that a smooth muscle contracts versus the skeletal muscle or the cardiac muscle, the ones we call stride muscles. Again, you don't have Z disc, so you're going to have instead those dense bodies. And when the thick and thin filaments slide across each other, you're going to be pulling on the dense bodies and the proteins that are forming what we call plaques in the membrane. It's just a wad of proteins that you can pull on. And so the force that you're getting as sliding those filaments apart will cause the cell to shorten. But as opposed to sliding back and forth from Z disc to Z disc like they do in the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, it's going to pucker the cell and twist it like you're wringing out a wet towel. So if you can see yourself taking a towel and wringing it out in your hands, it twists it as opposed to shortening and lengthening and shortening and lengthening that way. So it's a little different. So here's a little cartoon showing you the cells, the muscle fibers. And then here's what it looks like when they contract. As we mentioned before, the smooth muscle doesn't fatigue and it stays contracted longer. So the myosin, the head of the molecule, does not detach from the actin very quickly. So you don't need any more ATP, and you're going to have tetanus. You're going to remain contracted, and they call that smooth muscle tone. Places you're going to see that are in your arteries, in your intestines. So if you remember that the skeletal muscles, the really fast twitch, can do the twitch in 2 milliseconds, in 2/1000ths of a second. In the case of smooth muscle, it can take seconds, whole seconds, not milliseconds. And you're also going to have the slow myosin ATPase to slowly break it down. And instead of calcium binding to troponin, it's going to bind to calmodulin. So again, these are some differences. I'm not going to ask you that. I do expect you to know how troponin acts in the tropomyosin in the skeletal muscle, but we're getting further afield into stuff that there's just too many other things to learn. So looking at this, you guys should have absolutely no trouble telling the difference between these 3 types of muscle. This one would be your skeletal muscle. It's striated like that. This is your cardiac muscle. It is also striated, but it clearly has intercalated disc holding it together in bunches. And then your smooth muscle, you don't see any stripes. It's hard to see that they're fusiform, but if you follow it out, you can see that it's pointed on both ends. As I get older, I find that I enjoy Crabby Road. This is an old woman who has a very acerbic outlook on life. And she's always making pronouncements. I'm losing muscle tone in muscles I didn't even know I had. And notice, here she is. She's balancing on one foot, right there. But you notice her knees are wobbling. And her foot is wobbling. Her arm is wobbling. Her wrists are wobbling. So as you get older, you lose muscle tone. So one of the things they recommend older people do is do yoga. Do these stretches. And then, of course, I had to show this one. Here is some guy who is into yoga, and she is into fitness training. And she goes, "It would never work, Roger. I'm into muscle mass, and you're into yoga." So he's more into muscle tone, and she's more into actual bodybuilding and making more fibers in her skeletal muscle. Another interesting, but not so much fun thing that happens to you when you get older is you have trouble distending the esophagus or opening up your esophagus to allow yourself to swallow. So old people notice this mostly when they're trying to swallow a pill. But with the way they go around trying to swallow the pill, they actually make the problem worse. So the first thing they'll try to do is say, well, this pill is too big. I'm going to cut it up into pieces. Well, now you have jagged pieces that you're trying to swallow. And a jagged piece is much more likely to hang up in your throat than a piece that's nice and smooth, the way that it's made to go down your throat. The other thing is they think, well, I don't have any room in my esophagus to get the pill down, so I'm going to take the least little bit of water that I possibly can and try to wash this jagged piece of pill down. And they always end up choking. And they go, oh my gosh, I can't distend, or I can't stretch my esophagus to allow this pill to go through. So first thing is, don't cut it up into jagged pieces so there's nothing to hang up in your throat. And secondly, take a nice big swig, because your throat is used to swallowing and expanding to the pressure, of the bolus of water with the pill in it. So if you have a nice large mouthful of water and you've got a nice smooth pill, you shouldn't have problems with it hanging up in your throat. So I try to explain that to some of the elders that I know, and they're looking at me like, nope. So they continue to choke on their pills. Another thing that I'm going to point out here, and I'll point it out again, you have a stretch message when you get feces. So here's your poop traveling through your intestines, and it finally gets into your rectum, and it stretches the colon, and it sends you a message, hey, it's time to unload. It's time to make an offering to the porcelain goddess. If you ignore it, it will stop. It'll wait about 20 minutes, and then it's going to send you another signal. Hey, there's this mass of feces, and you need to allow the sphincter to open and allow the poop to leave your body. And if you're busy doing something else, playing a video game, too lazy to get up out of your chair, watching a movie, whatever, then it may give you a third warning about 20 minutes later and say, okay, last call, we need this to come out. If you ignore that one, probably what's going to happen is the feces will stop sending the message, it'll stop stretching, you'll get used to the stretch of having that feces there, and the longer you leave feces in the rectum and the colon, the more water is going to be pulled out. So it's just going to dry out, and now you're constipated. Now the feces is stuck in your intestines, and it's hard to get it out. So sometimes you have to take a stool softener to rehydrate the mass so that it'll come back out. I do expect you to understand peristalsis. And here's a picture of a slide right here showing the longitudinal. And here is the circular. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Here's the longitudinal. Here's the circular. And this is actually the intestinal villi. Right there. Okay. So this is going to be squeezing, and the poop, the food, is going to be moving along. And then if you zoom in really tight, here is the cross-sectional view. Here are the muscle fibers going longitudinally, and here's the ones that are going circular, and they're at 90-degree angles to each other. So here you're just looking at the ends of the muscle fiber, and here you're looking at the length of them. Here's another really big difference between skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle cannot be stretched and then contract strongly. It cannot be contracted and then contract strongly. But smooth muscle can contract forcefully even when greatly stretched, which is good, because think about where it is, in your intestines where you have a fecal mass, or in your bladder where you fill it up with urine. So if you stretched your bladder and then couldn't contract, you wouldn't be able to push all the urine out. Another thing that smooth muscle does, it allows the tension to release, kind of, they call it plasticity. So basically, it contracts without being flabby. I guess another word would be stretchy. It's stretchy, more so than the skeletal muscle. I'll not ask you this, but some people want to know, so I'm going to go ahead and show you this slide. The smooth muscle, remember, you don't have those Z-discs. So the thick and thin filaments are not arranged in nice orderly sarcomeres. And you don't have to worry about there not being enough overlap for the cross bridges to form, because there are myosin heads the full length of the myosin, so cross bridges can form anywhere. So that's one of the differences. One of the things that I was taught from an early age is don't eat undercooked pork. And the reason is because pigs tend to have trichina worms in their muscles. And if you don't kill these worms by cooking the meat thoroughly, and you eat the muscle of a pig, then you can get trichinosis, or you can get these trichina worms growing in your muscles also. So sometimes people eat undercooked pork and then they find their muscles just are getting weaker and weaker. That's because literally these worms are eating your muscles. So there are some religions that just don't eat pork at all. So they don't have to worry about whether it's cooked enough or not cooked enough. They just don't touch it. And possibly because of the trichina worms. I know that when I went overseas and started living in some of the foreign countries, there are countries where they eat raw bacon. And I thought, nope, I'll not be doing that, because I would be much too afraid of trichina worms. And they said, well, we don't have trichina worms in our pork. And I thought, it would be my luck, I would get a piece of the very first one that was infected with trichina worms. So, cook your pork. Don't eat it rare. When we did the chapter on genetics, we talked about sex-linked traits. So this would be usually something that's on the X chromosome. So the mother would be carrying it, and she can pass it on to her son. So one of the things that is out there is called muscular dystrophy, and it is a group of hereditary diseases where the skeletal muscle degenerates and weakens, and you replace it with fat and fibrous scar tissue. Well, obviously, then your muscle's not going to work if you've replaced it with fat and fiber, because scar tissue doesn't stretch. I was surprised to see the number. 1 out of every 3,500 boys has the sex-linked trait. That seems very, very high, but you don't see these children usually because they die young. And because their muscles are weakening and they're not working correctly, then they're not usually able to have babies. So they're not passing that gene on. The reason that it's not working, the muscle's not working, usually it is because there's a mutation in the gene for the muscle protein dystrophin. That's why they call it muscular dystrophy. So your actin isn't linked to the sarcolemma, and the cell membrane is damaged when you contract it. So when you damage it, it dies and scar tissue results. So this, you're going to have problems with respiration, you're going to have trouble with your cardiac muscles. There is no cure for it, and it kills early. There are other forms of muscular dystrophy. There's an autosomal dominant one. So that means that either girls or boys can get it. It usually works in the facial and the shoulder muscles more than in the lower muscles. And then there's another limb girdle dystrophy. It affects your shoulders, your arms, and your pelvis. Another thing that can go wrong with your muscles is called myasthenia gravis. And this is where you make antibodies to attack yourself. So that's what autoimmune means, where you attack yourself. And you're specifically attacking the neuromuscular junctions, and it's going to bind the acetylcholine receptors. Oddly enough, it usually occurs in women between the ages of 20 and 40. You remove the receptors by endocytosis. Literally, the muscle fiber just takes them as a big clump and pulls them inside. So now you don't have anything for the acetylcholine to bind to. So as you have fewer and fewer receptors, then the fiber becomes less and less sensitive to acetylcholine because there's nothing for it to bind to. Usually, the first symptoms that you're going to get are in your facial muscles. So your eyelids are going to start drooping. You're going to have double vision. You're going to have trouble swallowing, and your limbs are going to get extremely weak. Another thing is strabismus, where you have the inability to look at the same thing with both eyes. So one eye can look or the other eye can look, but you can't get them both going at the same time. What can you do to keep yourself from attacking your own acetylcholine receptors? You can give cholinesterase inhibitor. So what acetylcholine you have in the synapse will stay in there. So even though you don't have as many receptors, you can continue to stimulate the ones that you do have. So it'll stimulate the muscle a little bit longer. Another thing is if you could block the antibody. So they have immunosuppressive agencies that keep you from making the antibodies. And then plasmapheresis, take the blood out of the body, remove the antibodies, and then return the blood back to the person. So you're literally cleaning the antibodies out of the plasma. This would be rather extreme. We need our thymus to keep our immune system working, but if you take the thymus out, then they're hoping that it will stop your overactive immune response. It will stop you from making those antibodies that are causing the myasthenia gravis. So there's a few things to do. And I'll leave you with this test. I know that everybody's going to try this out. So if you look up, here's the start of the test. And after 60 seconds, you notice that this eye is still looking up, but one of the eyes has gone off. It's doing something else. And by a minute and a half, the eyelid's going to droop. So see this eyelid starting to droop? And there it goes. So spend a minute or a minute and a half, especially if you're a female, and see if that happens to you.